Well, it gives me great pleasure, 7 minutes after it should have started, to welcome you to the Planning Committee this evening. My name is Councillor Peter Clark, and I am the chair of this committee and will be, surprisingly, chairing the committee. I'd just like to say a few words before getting on with business. I've requested that this meeting of the Planning Committee should only hear one application this evening, which is for the Centrum Business Park. And I'd like to thank the Head of Planning for bringing just the one application before us this evening. I have done this to allow as many speakers as possible to address the committee and to allow the committee to have as much time as it needs to consider this important application. Centrum Business Park is an important application for Farnham, not just because of the scale of 159 dwellings, but due to its location being in close proximity to the centre of the town. The case officer for this application is Simon Dunlewin, who is an experienced urban planning officer. Simon's role is to assess the application by taking into consideration planning policy within the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan, Waverley's local plan, and national planning policy framework, which is set by the government. He must also consider feedback from statutory consultees, such as the Highways Authority, as well as the many letters he has received from local residents. This evening, we have 6 speakers addressing the committee, and I know they will provide members of the committee with a wide range of views, which means we have to offer courtesy to each and every speaker, whether you agree with what they say or not, and let them speak without interruption. Welcome to those in the public gallery. I can see we seem to have a reasonable bunch of polite citizens with us this evening. And I think many of you are represented by one, indeed, or more of the speakers that we have this evening. But just some words of caution. This is a meeting held in public. It is not a public meeting. So, members and officers, please raise your hand to indicate that you wish to speak. Please keep your microphone on mute when you are not speaking. Please can I also ask that any questions are kept brief and to the point. I would like to remind ward councillors to sit separately from the back, at the back, while applications are being considered for their ward and voted upon by the committee. So on to the agenda. First item, apologies for absence and substitution. Kim.
Thank you, Chair. The apologies have been received from Councillor Coburn, Councillor White, Councillor Sullivan and Councillor Keane, and we have Councillor David Beeman attending as a substitute.
Thank you. Minutes of the last meeting. Can I ask the committee if they are happy to approve the minutes of the last meeting? Agreed. Thank you. Declarations of interest. Have we had any, Kim?
No declarations have been submitted prior to the meeting.
Are there any declarations from the floor? Councillor Lott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to declare a non-pecuniary interest since I'm a member of the Farnham Town Planning and Licensing Group, but I'm of course open-minded for this evening's events. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Beeman?
Me too, same as Councillor Lott.
Understood. Thank you. Questions by members of the public. Do we have any, Kim?
None received, Chair.
Thank you. Questions from members. Kim, do we have any?
None received, Chair.
Thank you. I'll turn to the Head of Planning. Do we have any updates from the government on legislation or guidance since the last meeting?
No updates to report, Chair.
Thank you. Attached to the minutes, we have appeals decisions. So I would ask members to note the appeal decisions that are in the agenda pack and ask if you have any questions. Thank you. So we now turn to the main business of the evening. applications subject to public speaking. We have WA 2024/01557, Centrum Business Park, 35 to 42 East Street, Farnham, which is for the erection of 159 dwellings with associated landscaping, access parking, followed by phased demolition of the existing buildings. But I believe we have a slight amendment, Head of Planning.
Thank you, Chair. So members, just a slight amendment to the recommendation. So the recommendation is now to read that delegated authority is granted to the Assistant Director of Planning and subject to the completion of the legal agreement and confirmation from South East Water that they have no objection because there is sufficient capacity to supply this development, that planning permission is granted subject to conditions as per the agenda.
Thank you, Claire. We now turn to the presentation by the case officer, Simon Dunn-Lewin. Over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, everyone. As the Chair has pointed out, this is the site. This one. Slide.
Yep.
I see. Okay. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption. Thank you for your patience. So the site is Centrum Business Park, as the Chair mentioned, and this is the description of the development, which I won't repeat. You can see it on the screen. The site plan, the aerial view of the site plan with the red line boundary denotes where it actually sits. Some of you may know where it is. I'm sure many of you in the audience will know it. With some street scenes of photographs that looks at the business park from East Street, and this photograph is actually taken in this direction, looking at the leisure facility just by the entrance to the site, which is here. I hope you can see my cursor. And then the next one is the actual site entrance, and you can see in the far distance how the site drops down to Dogflood Way, and I'll touch on that a bit more in a moment. This is the corner furniture showroom, which some of you will be familiar with, taken from East Street again, looking at the entrance, and the photograph at the bottom is the view on Dogflood Way, looking at the sheds on the site. The site's currently used for a number of commercial uses. This building being the health club on the corner. The furniture store is here, and basically the sheds on the site accommodate warehousing and an MOT centre as well. Now, in terms of the context of the site, because there's been a number of planning permissions and new developments within the town centre, the site boundary of the designated town centre runs along Dogflood Way. This is the Brightwells development, which many will be familiar with. It's there now, next to the leisure centre over here. And that provided approximately 230 units, just from memory. The Woolmead site is currently, it has planning permission for 136 dwellings, up in a development up to 4 stories with a pitched roof, and I'll come back to heights in a moment. But that site is undeveloped, and there hasn't been a great deal happening there opposite Brightwells, which is completed. These two other sites are the Coach House, which is next to Lionsgate, and I believe many of the audience will be from Lionsgate. Coach House also has permission for 23 dwellings in a 4-story development with a pitched roof. So this is the context of the proposal for the Centrum site. on the edge of the town centre. It is an allocated site for 150 dwellings. And the relevant policies are covered in the report. I won't dwell too much on the detail of the report, which I'm sure you've had an opportunity to read. So moving on, this is the aerial view from the south, just hovering over the skate park next to the leisure centre. This is the Lidl's. Everyone will know that the listed Grade 2 listed building that's referred in the report under the heritage section is this one at number 29 East Street, and the site which is currently under construction, the coach house site that I referred to earlier on the previous slide, 80 to 84 East Street. This building's been demolished now. This whole complex here to the north of East Street, which runs along here, and this is the entrance into the site where the furniture stored on the ground floor of this two-story building. So this is Lionsgate here, and then we've got what we refer to as the cottages, 43 to 51 East Street, the two-story buildings. And again, under the amenity section, there's quite a lot of detail on how the amenity impacts have been assessed. So essentially, you can see that there's a sporadic dispersal of trees and bushes, largely self-seeded, around the edges of the site on Dog Floodway, coming around from East Street. But the site is completely hard surface. There are no trees within the site boundary of the development. The red line boundary includes right the way along the edge on Dog Floodway, but that part of the strip where where there are trees and bushes is actually highway land. And this is significant, this is important. But firstly, I'd like to just recap on the evolution of the design and how the whole concept of the scheme has evolved since 2020. So it's taken 5 years for this scheme to get to committee tonight. The initial proposals from the architects were presented to council officers from 2020 onwards. It was refined following consideration by the Design for South East design review, an independent design review panel in September 2023. So the designers have responded to the concerns or the comments made by the design panel, which was to integrate the development more with public space and public domain, more connectivity with the town centre, but there was no particular criticism of the scale or massing. Now, the application that came in last year did respond to officer concerns about height and massing, and you can see that on East Street in particular, blocks E and F, the orange outline denotes what it was originally at the pre-app stage, but at the application stage, the reduction in height and massing you can see in the green, just to illustrate what the changes are. And this was the application submission in 2024. Granted that there was some tree planting suggested along East Street, which I'll show you later on the current final amended scheme. And essentially the blocks A to E, 6 blocks laid out with X. This was the original submission. So I'm just going to show you the massing diagram that accompanied it, which shows how the blocks would be arranged within the site and how it relates to the new development at the coach house on the north side of East Street. This is block F. Lionsgate over here, opposite block E, and the so-called cottages, 43 to 51 East Street, adjacent to Block C. Now, this was the original scheme following design review and comment feedback from council officers, design officers, as well as planning officers. Now, it has gone through another round of amendments and iterations in response to the scaling of the development. And you can see this is Block C on the corner of East Street and Dogflood Way, which was reduced from the original height of 6 stories down to 5. The 5th floor, or the 5th story, being the roof space, just to illustrate the changes that are being made in responding to local concerns as well as officer concerns. Now, this is another view of Block C, looking at it from East Street and the relationship between the two. It is a tight pinch point, and this is covered in the report, but in terms of privacy distances, it respects the SPD on balance. It exceeds it or very close to it. The garden distances is something that's already been covered, and we can make exception. There is some harm, but the harm is limited in our opinion, given the context of the scheme and the site itself within the town centre. So these are illustrations opposite Mike Hawthorne Drive. This is to put it into context and to give you a 3D shot of it rather than 2D black and white drawings. You can see that the blocks being proposed are architecturally sound and robust. They do provide the required number of accommodation on site, albeit that at the moment it sits at 159, slightly marginally more than the allocation. But nevertheless, you can see from the illustrations how it sits within the local context. And this is another view with Brightwells in the background, Mike Hawthorne Drive entrance here. This is Block A. Distinct treatment to the architectural language between the two blocks. So there's some individuality rather than monotonous architecture, if you like. Our urban designers have looked at these schemes, and the final designs are welcomed in a town centre context. So we have worked extensively with the applicants on making sure that the designs fit the townscape and characterization. So this is another view within the internal courtyard, looking at building C, which I mentioned earlier, with building D to the left. In order for me to pinpoint these buildings, I'll show you the positioning on the overall layout in a moment. But the concept is really because of the gradient from East Street down to Dogflood Way, there's a site level difference of about 5 meters. So it's quite steep. There's a steep drop in it. And the architects, well, the main architect, Max Lyons, described it at the Farnham Town Council meeting in mid-July, that basically you've got a situation where there's a hole in the ground because there's been expressions of concern about story heights exceeding what's actually in the neighbourhood plan. But in order to maximise the efficient use of land and to deliver the number of dwellings, you've got to have fairly sizable chunks of buildings on this site. This is another view of building D with the archway going through building D. And again, you can see the drop from the upper courtyard going down towards the lower courtyard and building A in the background. So that's where we were. There's been further refinements undertaken by the architects as a result of discussions following submission, and some of these, and essentially this is the final scheme which has been submitted. Blocks E and F being of great concern to residents in East Street, this is not the final elevation, but it provides some illustration of how the refinements that have been made, and I can just show you in terms of setting what they've done was to set the blocks back to create more public space or perception of public space within the street scene. Now, there has been concern about the fact that comments were made by the Highways Department that there's an opportunity missed for widening the access, or rather the footway along this stretch of East Street, which members would have seen on their site visit on Monday. But the Highway Authority have reconsidered their position and accept that, you know, whilst it's a desire, in essence, it doesn't have to be a wider footway provided along this edge, because you've got to have defensible space to this block, which is already set back, and it will create more space within the street with softer landscapings, which will enhance the visual amenities of the area. Just to touch on what further refinements have been done to the blocks, particularly block F, is that the final amendments have taken away these bay projections at ground and first floor level to flatten the frontage, to make it clean, to make cleaner lines of the actual building mass, and also cut back on the roofscape as well. So it has overall reduced in bulk. And this is the final layout that has come in, which shows you the areas that I've just mentioned, which is the wider landscaping strip onto East Street by setting the buildings further back. Building E is also set back with a soft landscaping strip to enhance the visual amenities of the area. And this is an upper courtyard and the lower courtyard. Buildings A, B, C, D. D will be imperceptible apart from the roofscape, possibly when it is and gets permission and gets built eventually, which is probably 4 to 5 years down the line. The most prominent buildings would be E and F, but they are 4 stories. So C is sitting at 5 stories, but it has also been reduced at roof level. It's been cut back, and that's where the loss of the 3 units have come from the original submission of 162 down to 159. So buildings A and B, in terms of height, again, if I can just park that for a second and come back to it in a moment, but you can see the layout is to provide access mainly from East Street. That's the main access point. There's no vehicular access onto Dogflood Way. The local connections will be made with a zebra crossing provided across Dogflood Way by Mike Hawthorne Drive in this area. There will be some tree planting and landscaping to enhance the public domain. The overall net increase in numbers is about 25 trees, albeit that the trees along the edge that I showed earlier on the aerial image will be taken away. But that's partly to accommodate the building line so that the crowns will be impacted, but also because Surrey County Council Highways have an aspiration, as I said, to provide an extension of this footway on the north side of Dogflood Way, all the way along this bend up to East Street, and again within the site, so that the connections with and local desire lines have been enhanced. So you've got pedestrian access points here. The other thing I ought to touch on is that representations have been made by number 43 on the corner. We looked at this on the site visit on Monday. Their concerns about vehicular access from East Street, which will be maintained. They have a right of way over that, so that issue is addressed. But just to come back to the point about public domain and connections. So essentially the tree loss along here, which is a loss of 10 trees, but as I said, the net gain across the site from ornamental tree planting and soft landscaping. And again, we will secure this via a planning condition for details for approval, subject to a 5-year replacement program, as well as the update paper that you have before you, which is the management of the site is to be included as part of a Section 106 agreement to make sure that they maintain it in the long run. Now, moving on to the pedestrian connection, cycle routes through the site as well. Active England have actually got no issue with this. The Highway Authority welcome the increased connections with local routes, particularly along to the south to Dog Flood Way, Borelli Walk, as you can see, and to the leisure centre, Brightwells, and beyond into the town centre as well. So this is just to show you an illustration of it. Now, in terms of height, I know there's been a lot of debate, and I've had endless letters from local residents, one of whom will be speaking about, you know, the height issue, whether or not the 4 stories is actually what it says it is. We can only go by the surveys that are provided by the architects, and these are the heights, which is AOD heights being above ordnance datum, which is sea level. So just to show you, if I can move this out of the way, apologies, just bear with me. They maintain that it's equivalent to the, or on par or below Brightwells at 84 AOD. Now, 84 AOD is roughly about 19.5 meters from ground level, depending on where the ground level sits, because as you can see from here, the gradient from East Street down to Dog Flood Way as a cross section, there's a 5-meter difference. Now, the heights of the building blocks A and B, and this is a section through building A, and you can see that essentially it will still maintain that or respect that maximum height. I've also looked at Woolmead as well, and I measured Woolmead at 84.5 AOD. And I've also looked at the Coach House development, which measures 15 meters from ground level to the top. Now, building E, just to be clear, measures 13.36 meters. So it's actually lower than the Coach House development and Woolmead, and of course, Brightwell. So this is why we refer to parity and respecting the overall scale and height within the town centre and other developments which have been approved. Just to show you a typical elevation, which is Block D, this is the courtyard development, and you can see how steep the courtyard, the undulation of the courtyard as it drops from East Street with the archway through that you saw in the image earlier. And also from the access point of East Street to come into the site next to building D. So there's your archway. It's just flipped around the other way, and you can see how it drops down in a typical section with a balcony view along the courtyard. And these are the balconies that look across over the courtyard, the higher upper courtyard and the lower courtyard. And we've got some undercrop parking there as well, which you can't really see very clearly from the layout, but if I can go back to it, I can show you roughly where that is. So this is building D again, And that was the sloping access road that comes in off East Street down to the lower end. And the undercroft parking is actually just there, just below that corner of building D. So overall 37 parking spaces and some sitting out areas for with public access right across the site for connections to the south. So going back to the typical elevation, there are 80 drawings plus. So I've only just picked out a couple just to give you an illustration of what an elevation would look like. And in terms of Block C that I mentioned earlier, this is the cutback at roof level, 4th floor level, the top floor, which has resulted in the 3-unit reduction to the overall numbers. And it also provides some relief to the cottages on the north side, because obviously it is a substantial building that would be close to their boundary. But looking at the daylight sunlight report, we have we appointed an expert in the field, Mr. Matthew Kraske, who was a director at Anstey Horn, which is one of the top daylight sunlight firms, operating on his own as an independent now. And the advice, which is published on our website, concludes overall, and this guy actually gives evidence in court as well on rights to light. Highly respected with over 30 years experience. And if he tells me that, in his opinion, given the scale and nature of the development and the context, the shortfalls on the BRE guidelines are not huge. They are marginal or minimal, and in his opinion, acceptable. And this is covered in quite a bit of detail within the report. Now, moving on to the phasing plan, which I've included partly because we've got an update with additional conditions, one of which is referring to the SIL phasing plan, just to give an idea of how the site will be built out. So the initial phase would demolish the existing sheds in the furniture building, the showroom building, and then this will allow the commencement of the bulk of the development in 5 blocks A to E, with the remaining leisure facility along East Street being the last building to be taken down, and Block F constructed in this location. So members will note, if the update papers are before you, that the additional SIL condition 38 refers to this plan. And we clarified the reason why in the update, as well as the SANG clarification and an additional condition for the SANG. We've also added a condition and another condition, so we're up to 40 conditions now on disabled parking, and the requirement for this scheme is 3 spaces for disabled parking. So that will be coming in should the application be approved, subject to that condition. So they've got to clear a number of not just safeguarding conditions, which are referred to, among which include air pollution, noise, drainage, decontamination. They can't even start the development without discharging these conditions. So they are pre-commencement conditions. So just moving on to the final images. This is the image of Block E, just to give you an idea about the kind of the design, the architectural detail, the palette of materials to be used on the development, which is going to be traditional brick-built buildings, reminiscent of, I suppose, Georgian architecture, if I can put it that way. Certainly Georgian style windows. So it has a mix of appeal in terms of the building C, which is slightly different, and it has a certain aesthetic quality about it. And these are all opinions that have been had by our own urban design advisors. And this is the final image which you saw earlier. This remains the same. So the cutback you can't see in this image because it's hidden behind the tree, but there is a cutback on the top corner. So essentially, Chair, officers have assessed this scheme in quite a bit of detail. We've consulted widely, and our conclusion is that given all the features and merits of the scheme and limited harm, that on balance in MPPF terms, the public benefits accrued for this development, which is summarised on page 69 within the historic heritage section on environmental, on economic benefits, that on balance, the tilted balance is engaged in MPPF under para 11D, and our recommendation is to approve it subject to the legal agreement and the heads of terms. And there's also an update on the amount of NHS contributions that they need to contribute as a result of further chasing the NHS to make sure that, you know, we had the most up-to-date information. And subject to the legal agreement with the changes in the update paper as set out and the conditions with the additional conditions, permission be granted, Chair. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Simon, for a very detailed presentation. Before we turn to a discussion with members of the committee, we have, as I mentioned earlier, we have 6 speakers. And the first is a Mr. Barry Saunders. And I understand that Mr. Saunders will be speaking on behalf of some or all of the residents at Lionsgate. Mr. Saunders, you have 4 minutes. If you turn your microphone on with the switch in the middle, and the timer will start when you start to speak. Thank you.
Stop.
Good evening, Chair. Good evening, committee members. My name is Barry Saunders. I live in Lionsgate opposite proposed central development, and I speak on behalf of many residents there and nearby. We all knew this site was one day being developed, but what we did not expect was the scale and density of what is now proposed 6 uniform blocks up 6 stories high for 159 dwellings, many more than the 150 identified in the neighbourhood plan. With this as a precedent to the 3 further blocks envisioned in the applicant's own statement, the eventual population could approach 400 on this small island site. For those of us in Lionsgate, the impact will be devastating. We're currently a south-facing, well-lit community. Many of our residents are older, some in their 80s. Sunlight and outlook are not luxuries for us, but vital to health and well-being. Yet this scheme would take that away. For much of the winter, Block C, E and F will cast Lionsgate into shadow. First and second floor living areas will lose direct sunlight for many months at a time. Other homes along East Street will fare even worse. This also means a real measurable loss of daylight and a gloomy setting at the very time people need sun and light the most. We will also suffer a loss of outlook. Presently we enjoy an open southerly aspect. Under this plan, our windows will face a sheer wall of massing from blocks E and F, creating an oppressive enclosing environment. This is a material harm to amenity. Privacy too will be lost because Lionsgate sits below street level. Residents of Block E, even on the same floors, will look directly down into our homes and onto balconies. The privacy walls, which were shown in the figure, we have now will be meaningless. Then there is the canyon effect. Block C and F, combined with the new flats already rising beside us, will form a continuous frontage opposite our windows. It will be overbearing with the sole access road directly opposite our own car access, Traffic noise and air pollution will inevitably increase, reverberating between the hard surfaces and worsening the living environment. Beyond amenity, there's also the serious drainage concerns. The Flood Authority has raised substantial reservations about the Centrum site in its objection, and clearly this aspect is not mature enough. Under such circumstances, and with the steady flow of water down the hill from Farnham Park, there's a real risk that effective drainage from Lionsgate and neighbouring properties will be compromised. Lionsgate apparently suffered from past flooding before I moved in, and Centrum can only add to risk for residents now and in the future. The officer's report treats each impact, sunlight, privacy, outlook, overbearing, enclosure separately, often dismissing them as marginal, acceptable in context, or subject to conditions. But the real world does not work that way. Committee members, these impacts also need to be judged in the round. Taken together holistically, the combined harm is severe. Planning case law confirms this. In a recent national appeal, a 5-storey block was refused because even where daylight levels were technically acceptable, the bulk created a harmful sense of enclosure and an overbearing impact. Similarly, in Hazelmere, a proposal was refused for bulk, loss of light, overbearing impact, and loss of privacy. Exactly the combination of harms residents here will face. Members, this scheme is simply too tall, too dense, too harmful for residents and for Farnham, and currently too risky to be approved in its current form. I can't help wondering if you as individual residents would be yourselves objecting if this was in your own locality. I urge you to use your judgment and to refuse this application. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sanders. Our second speaker would have been Councillor Catherine Powell, but as Catherine is on holiday, she has asked Mr. Chris Jackman to make her statement. You too, Chris, have got 4 minutes as and when you start to speak. Thank you.
Good evening, councillors. As the chair has said, this is delivered on behalf of Catherine Powell, who is unfortunately unable to be here this evening. So while the site is allocated in the neighbourhood plan, Catherine Powell urges this committee to refuse the application for a number of reasons. She believes it constitutes overdevelopment and raises serious concerns for both current and future residents of Farnham, including those who may one day live on this very site. Under FMP Policy 14J, the Centrum site must meet specific requirements, many of which are not fulfilled, including the removal of undercroft parking that has left inadequate provision for many. The proposed height still exceeds the 4-storey limit, reaching 6 storeys in places, impacting daylight for homes on East Street and the Swain Jones site. The light survey itself noted that there are areas on the proposed development where daylight and sunshine levels fall below the recommended BRE guidelines, and that the required access improvements from East Street and Dogflood have not been delivered. The narrow pavements remain untouched, seemingly to maximise the building footprint. Although the officer report mentions improvements to the south, it is noted that connectivity to Farnham Park to the north, the nearest green space, is overlooked. Despite the refinement of their stance, the County Highway Authority has expressed concerns, stating only minor widening of the existing footway on the East Street boundary of the site is proposed, contrary to the CHA's view that the redevelopment of the site provides a unique opportunity to provide a 3-metre wide shared footway along this section of East Street, which could then be extended further as other redevelopment sites come forward. And that the CHA considers that this is a missed opportunity, even if not strictly required in planning terms. As members of the Planning Committee, you're here to consider the planning balance. Is this acceptable, we ask? This is going to be the only opportunity to widen East Street pavements and promote active travel, essential for the environment and for public health. Approving this development tonight would mean losing that opportunity permanently. In addition, Surrey County Council, acting as the local lead flood authority, has objected to the application. The proposal fails to meet the NPPF, and there is no evidence that the layout can be made compliant. Councillor Power is concerned that the use of condition 15 as a pre-commencement condition contradicts NPPF guidance. In Farnham, where the water table is high and geology complex, such conditions often lead to compromises at the reserve matters stage that harm residents and the wider area long term. With climate change intensifying rainfall, every development must maximise the potential to retain water. Failure to do so increases flood risk, not just in Farnham, but downstream in places like Elsted and Godalming. Despite previous calls to address this at the outline stage, when layout and design are most flexible, this opportunity has again been missed. This development also delivers zero affordable housing, let alone the social housing which is most needed, and will make no 106 contribution towards creating it somewhere else, as it has been argued that SIL payment is so high it makes it unaffordable to the developer. Councillor Powell therefore asks how will Farnham's much needed social housing be funded and where will it be built? She considers this a highly sustainable site, ideal for social housing. Officers propose that SIL will have to fund the social housing gap, address the inadequate pedestrian and cycling facilities on East Street, and all other infrastructure demands associated with Farnham's growing population, from school places to sports pitches. This is not appropriate for the planning balance. Councillor Powell respectfully requests that the committee defer its decision to allow the applicant to address these concerns or refuse the application outright so a better proposal can be brought forward. She urges members to listen very carefully to Mr Saunders, who spoke earlier, and on behalf of the residents of Lionsgate and East Street, who will be directly affected by this overdevelopment, among others. Thank you for your time.
All right, you cut it fine there, Mr Jackman, but you managed it perfectly. Our third speaker is, I believe, the agent, who is a Mr Matt Hill. Thank you, Mr Hill. You as well have 4 minutes as and when you start to speak.
Chair, members, this application is the culmination of a detailed and constructive planning process, characterised by extensive engagement with officers in the council over the last 5 years. I want to begin by thanking the officers for their time, guidance and collaborative approach throughout. The officers have set out a clear and thorough report, and I'd like to focus on the work that has gone into the scheme and the very clear positives that it brings to Farnham. As I'm sure you are all aware, this is a brownfield site that is allocated for residential development in the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan. Bringing forward a previously developed centrally located site such as this is exactly what both national and local policy require. It most importantly reduces pressure on having to develop on greenfield sites in out-of-town areas, of which this borough has many, and directs growth into sustainable urban areas within walking distance of the railway station, shops, services and the leisure centre. It's also important to understand that Waverley currently has an acute shortfall in its 5-year housing land supply, less than 2 years when the requirement is over 5. This scheme will provide 159 new homes, making a very important contribution towards meeting local need. These are much needed 1, 2 and 3 bedroom flats. The applicant has worked closely with the council since 2020, including presenting to the Independent Design South East Review panel. The proposals have evolved through a design-led process and through thorough engagement with planning officers, Surrey Highways, Town Council and local groups, to name a few. The layout has been carefully refined, with massing reduced and the 2 tallest buildings placed at the lowest point on Dogflood Way, rising to 5 stories with additional accommodation in the roof. Separation has been provided to the blocks alongside enhanced landscaping and new pedestrian and cycle linked through the site. Officers, the Urban Design Officer and the Design Panel all support the quality of the final scheme. The development will further deliver new green infrastructure with significant biodiversity gains of over 500%. It promotes sustainable transport with new pedestrian and cycle routes, a zebra crossing, linking the leisure centre and improving safety on the surrounding roads, improving the local bus stop, extensive cycle parking for normal and electric bikes and provisions for car sharing. This ensures residents will have a genuine alternative to private cars in this highly accessible location. Furthermore, the scheme will generate local construction jobs, but most significantly, over 5 million in community infrastructure levy contributions. This is alongside Section 106 contributions to the Borough for Healthcare and SPA and SANG mitigation. It will also regenerate this gateway into Farnham and much improve the appearance of this very tired part of East Street, providing a safer and more attractive environment, which we know has been a concern to members previously. We also know that the relocation of the existing tenants on the site has also been a concern, and the applicants, being local and having a vested interest in Farnham, have already arranged a very nearby location for the MOT centre, and continues to look for suitable premises for the other tenants. This scheme represents exactly the kind of development that Farnham needs. Much needed homes on sustainable, allocated brownfield site away from the greenbelt, designed to a high standard and shaped through extensive engagement. It will regenerate a prominent gateway into the town, deliver environmental improvements, support active, safer travel, and provide real economic benefits for the local area. It has been judged by officers to be acceptable in all aspects, and we respectfully ask members to support the recommendation to grant planning permission. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Our next speaker was going to be the Farnham Town Council, but I believe there are some technical issues with Councillor Fairclough presenting the Farnham Town Council statement, and I understand that Kim has a copy of this and is going to read it out to the committee.
Thank you, Chair. As you will have read, Centrum Business Park is an allocated site in the 2020 Farnham Neighbourhood Plan under policy FNP 14J for a flattered development of approximately 150 dwellings. The assessment of the site for inclusion in the neighbourhood plan summarised that the brownfield site was in a highly sustainable urban location close to a range of facilities and public transport. It should also be noted that a request for a screening opinion was submitted by the applicant to Waverley Borough Council in April 2024 for up to 170 residential dwellings with associated car parking and landscaping on the site. Screening opinion is a request to the local planning authority for developments over the threshold of 150 dwellings to determine if a proposed development is likely to have significant environmental effects and require an environmental impact assessment. Farnham Town Council wanted further analysis on the intensification of the access for residential and delivery vehicles travelling through the Farnham Air Quality Management Area and a visual impact assessment to see the compatibility with the surrounding built form of the proposed heights of the blocks. The local planning authority concluded that an environmental impact assessment was not required. Assessing air quality and townscape impacts should be provided with a planning application for the proposed development. That planning application is before you today for determination. Farnham Town Council did raise objection to the height of the blocks at 6 storeys on the southern side of the site. Policy guidance in the neighbourhood plan states that undercroft parking should be provided with 4-storey residential development stepping down the natural slope of the site. The applicant has amended plans slightly to reduce bulk of roof elements, setting back the roof lines, reducing the scheme from 162 dwellings to 159 dwellings, but maintaining 6 storeys on the southern side. Concern is raised about access onto the site for vehicles, even though this is proposed as a low parking development. 159 dwellings will generate vehicle movements from deliveries and residential parking. A delivery bay is included on Dogfleet Way for larger vehicles. Farnham Town Council would like to see a locker service included for smaller deliveries to reduce the number of vehicles accessing the site. If granted, Farnham Town Council requests that a condition must be included to restrict future residents from applying for parking permits in Farnham Town Centre Controlled Parking Zone A to avoid further parking congestion on local residential roads. Although some pedestrian connectivity could be gained through a previously inaccessible site and the potential to deliver a pedestrian crossing on Dogflood Way, further improvements for pedestrians and cyclists are needed to connect to the wider network. Planting, including large trees, have been included on the site to soften the scheme and add biodiversity. If granted, conditions have been included to maintain the planting scheme for a minimum of 5 years. Consideration must also be given to the wider maintenance of the buildings, especially those with rendering. Farnham Town Council acknowledges the difficulties of delivering an age of town centre brownfield development and the viability of a high quality scheme. It has been confirmed that a commuted sum to deliver off-site affordable housing is unlikely to be available, which is disappointing. Finally, SANG provision must be in line with Farnham Neighbourhood Policy FNP 12. It must be readily accessed from and well connected to the development it serves to mitigate the impact on the Thames Basin Heath Special Protection Area. It is hoped that Farnham Park has capacity to serve the development if granted. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. We turn now to our 5th speaker, who is Waverley Borough Councillor and it's Councillor Jerry Hyman, which I believe will be on Zoom.
He is on Zoom.
Good evening, Councillor Hyman. As usual, you know the rules. You have 4 minutes from when you start.
Thank you. Good evening, Chairman. Good evening to members. Yes, this does. I'm not going to repeat what previous speakers have said, and in particular what Mr. Saunders has said on behalf of Lyongate residents. But we know that the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan does limit development to 4 stories, and we've always tried to do so in Farnham. So I think there's a strong argument that this is excessive. But the reason that I'm here is because I've noticed particular mistakes in the officer advice, which I think the officers will have to agree with. If you wouldn't mind turning, please, to the update sheet that you've got before you, members, pages 5 and 6, which refers to the SANG clarification, which Simon, the case officer, also referred to. You'll see that under there it says that the capacity, SANG capacity at Farnham Park can't be guaranteed, so there will need to be a further condition, and the Section 106 agreement will be worded in a way to require the SANG payment at the point where we've decided what mitigation there'll be. Well, unfortunately, our new officers obviously don't realise that ever since time began, as far as the nature of directives, the Habitats Directive is concerned, 2007, back in 2007. Ever since then, the council has completely accepted case law from the EIA and nature directives, which determines that assessments cannot be conditioned. You cannot possibly have conducted an assessment of the effectiveness and security of the SANG mitigation if you don't know what it's going to be, and you've been told there with absolute certainty that you don't know. So the details of the mitigation are not available to you now. You know that, and the law dictates that you cannot grant consent unless you have the details of the mitigation and also details of demonstrating its effectiveness, although the councils have usually thrown that part of the law out of the window for a long time. So we know full well that you cannot condition, you don't have an assessment in front of you, you can't grant consent without having conducted an appropriate assessment, and without the details you can't have conducted an appropriate assessment, and therefore you cannot grant consent lawfully. Now, I've put a question into council next week, members, which is it asks the question of whether or not that consent can be granted in such circumstances. You need to know the answer for yourselves tonight. Now, what I've told you is what the law requires. It's not my own opinion. It's what the law states. If you want to check for yourself in C32317, People over Wind and Sweetman, which confirmed that you must have full details of the mitigation. That's paragraph 35 to 38 of the judgment in that case law, and that applies. It's mentioned in your officer report somewhere around page 69, I think that is, that it refers to that law. But the officers have made a mistake here in saying that you can condition this where you cannot. So this needs to be deferred for a proper appropriate assessment when the available mitigation has been determined. And you either defer for that or you must refuse. The law does not allow you to grant consent without having an appropriate assessment. I would just add also that means that there are further mistakes, of course, in the papers where the presumption in favour of sustainable development has been, and where the officer has said that the tilted balance applies. It doesn't. Paragraph 195, I've got it up in front of me on my computer, of the MPPF says the presumption in favour of sustainable does not apply where the plan of project is likely to have a significant effect on a habitat site alone in combination with other plans of projects, unless an appropriate assessment has concluded that the plan of project will not adversely affect the integrity of the habitat site. You know for a fact you don't have details of the habitat.
Can you wind up now, Councillor Hyman?
Thank you. I'm just finishing. So you know full well that you don't have an appropriate assessment, and the tilted balance does not apply. So you must refuse consent or defer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Hyman. We now turn to Councillor George Hess, who is a Waverley Borough councillor, and he is the ward member for the Castle Ward, which includes the development. George, you have 4 minutes now, and at my discretion, you can follow up afterwards once the committee has had a debate.
Thank you, Chair. I'm here tonight, as the Chair said, to speak on Centrum as a Waverley Castle Ward councillor. Firstly, I acknowledge Centrum is a designated site in the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan and accept it will be developed at some point. But the question I have is what will be built there and the effect it will have on residents and on the east end of Farnham for decades to come. This is going to stretch well into the future. Members may remember an all-member briefing on planning early in the administration when we were told that if you refuse an application, you need valid policy reasons. I'd like to read Waverley's LPP2 DM4, Quality Places Through Design, and Policy DM5, Safeguarding Amenity, if you'll bear with me. Sorry, this will be a bit tedious, but I'll just read them through. Policy DM4A says, all new development should respond effectively to its surroundings, reinforcing local distinctiveness. And B, the scale of development should take into account height, mass, form, bulk in relation to surrounding structures. And then policy DM5 says, development must avoid harming the well-being and amenity of existing and future occupants of nearby land, buildings and residences by way of overlooking, loss of daylight or sunlight, or overbearing appearance that negatively affects the surroundings. Developments may be refused or conditioned unless they can demonstrate avoidance of adverse impact on privacy. I've been contacted by a number of concerned residents worried sick about being potentially completely overlooked and losing their privacy by Centrum's Block E, which would look down on their balconies and habitable rooms, particularly of flats 3 and 4 in Liongate, which is directly opposite and at a distance of only 13.5 metres. When general UK planning guidance calls for separation distance of around 20 metres. Waverley don't publish separation distances, suggesting each application is decided on its merit. Fair enough. But the fact is, 13.5 metres is much too close and would have an adverse impact on their privacy and amenity, and I suggest their mental well-being and health. Furthermore, because the floor levels of Liongate are some 800 millimetres below Centrum's Block E floor level, it leaves occupants exposed to looking down from above, in addition to overlooking. Finally, Farnham Neighbourhood Plan Policy FNP 14J, previously referred to, says, and this is very clear, it's in black and white, and if you're not sure, I've got a copy of the neighbourhood plan in my hand. Advantage should be taken of the sloping site, 4-storey development, stepping down the natural slope, that the site is located an important approach to the town centre and conservation area, and proposals should combine high-quality design which enhances this approach. But instead of that, what you see is 6 stories, completely ignoring FNP 14J at the southern end of the site in pursuit of more apartments, in fact 6% more than the FNP recommended, with huge overbearing gables on Block B. So I'm going to cut out a little bit because I'm running out of time. I'd like to just say to the committee tonight, heartfelt, in deciding this application, the committee holds the future of the Eastern Gateway to Farnham and the well-being of its residents in its hands. And as there are too many serious flaws with this scheme, and there are policies in place which, if ignored, would make approval frankly wrong, I ask you to please refuse or at least defer this application so the applicants can comply with planning policies and return here with a much more acceptable scheme. Thank you, members. Thank you, Chair.
And thank you, Councillor Hess. That's our 6 speakers this evening. We will now turn to members of the committee. And who is going to go first? I can see Councillor Rubini, followed by Councillor Beeman.
Thank you, Chair. Said it before and I'll say it again. Affordable housing. Yet again, we demand X number of houses in an estate. We go ahead with planning on that sort of condition. And then a viability study from the company comes back and says, we can't afford it. And our own independent ones agree. My problem is that this is happening more and more in town centres, and I've seen it right across Waverley. So we're building estates that the people or community in Farnham is going to find it very difficult to afford, because these houses will be expensive. And there's no provision at all for local people who haven't got that sort of money. So I'm sorry, I really must go against this sort of plan. Now, also, I feel that we are saying here that the developer hasn't got the money to do it with the affordable housing. Now, I don't know whether this developer is actually standalone or whether he's part of a bigger organisation. I know that across the country, occasionally people bring up the fact that the money from the bigger organisation should be somehow put towards the smaller one, and not just the local profit, but an overall profit. So I'm sorry, yet again, I think we should be building affordable housing. And as somebody mentioned during their speeches now, social housing. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we got social housing? We're not going to get that, but we're not even getting affordable. So I've got to be against it. Thank you.
Councillor Beeman, then Councillor Gale.
Well, first a technical
Councillor
question.
Weldon. Councillor MacLeod.
Okay, a technical question. Could the Assistant Director of Planning advise us how much SANG provision is left in Farnham Park, please?
Members, I think I should cover a number of the points that were brought up in Councillor Hyman's speech. So, members, on our website, we are saying that we have 171 capacity for 171 dwellings, but the numbers we have counted are the permissions granted rather than occupied properties. So we've taken a worst case scenario because we know, as you know, that we grant permissions, but they aren't always implemented. And the need for mitigation isn't at the point we grant a permission, it's on occupation, because at occupation, the recreational pressure occurs. Apologies. So I'll just move my laptop because that might help a bit. So just to repeat that point, the figure online is 171 dwellings that we have capacity for in Farnham Park, but the figures are based on permissions granted. And actually the need for mitigation is on point of occupation, because it's when the people are occupying the buildings that the recreational pressure occurs, and therefore the mitigation is needed rather than the grant of planning permission. The scheme we've got before us this evening is within that 171 number, but we had on Thursday an appeal that was granted, which was 23, which would take us to 172. But that is permissions granted, not implementation. So because there's a differential of one number and potentially a few other unilaterals for one or two dwellings, we have recommended this evening that there's a Grampian style condition put on. So if this permission is implemented and we're 1 or 2 or 3 over, then the issue of capacity is addressed correctly through alternative mitigation. And we know, members, that we currently have a planning application in the system that is heading towards an approval that will give 1,000 dwelling capacity, SANG capacity within the Farnham area. And there are also other live discussions about acquiring additional SANG. So there's projects in place. So members, Councillor Hyman has suggested that the appropriate assessment isn't fit for purpose because we've suggested in using a gramping condition that makes that appropriate assessment not fit for purpose. As officers, as planning officers, we believe that appropriate assessment is appropriate for the reasons I've set out, and Natural England have agreed that appropriate assessment, which is displayed on the website. So, Councillor Beeman, that's a more expanded answer to the question, but hopefully that will explain to the committee where that figure has come from and why that figure is effectively an over-optimistic figure because it's the permissions granted, not occupation.
Can I just ask a technical question of the head of planning? Can SANG be split between two sites?
Yeah, so we're very familiar in this borough with the Farnham Park being the mitigation, but SANG can be provided elsewhere as long as it is provided in a way and at a distance that is an attractive recreational offer for people that occupy. So in other authorities I've worked in where we've had SANG, there may be 2 or 3 SANGs that could provide a mitigation for a specific development because it's all within easy accessible distance from the development, and that's can be is the case in some of the schemes we've seen coming through Guildford. So yes, you can have 2 SANGs that are in easy accessible distance from a development, and some of the mitigation can be seen from one and the other as long as they are complying with what is required by a SANG and they're secured through legal agreements, they're there in perpetuity, they meet all the criteria for SANG.
Thank you, Claire. Excuse me. Do you have any further points to make, Councillor Beeman?
Yeah, just a slight pedantic point, I suppose. Blocks E and F are I think the presentation was 4 stories at 13.6 high. Is that correct? You said in your presentation? Is that right?
Yes, councillor.
Right, okay. That implies per story 3.4 metres per story. Yet on blocks F, the bottom ones, A and B, are 6 stories, yet the drop's only 5 metres. So, I mean, that seems to me a bit obtuse to me. How am I being thick?
Well, those are the heights that are proposed for the 4-storey building. So if they have high ceilings internally, then presumably that will be the answer to your question. The internal room heights do have to comply with building regulations, as far as I'm aware, for at least 2.5 metres, and then you've got the thickness of the floors in between. So technically speaking, yes, they could be up to 3 metres floor to floor.
It's only 5 metres. What I'm saying is that, does that imply that blocks A and B are going to be higher than blocks E and F?
Now, the heights that I've already mentioned for blocks A and B, at 6 stories into the roof space, by the way, with loft space, is the heights that I've put in the report as AOD, and I've translated that into heights above adjacent ground level, which I mentioned earlier, which was at block A would be 19.56 metres, block B would be 19.55 metres, block C is 16.05, block D is 19 metres, block E is 13.36 metres above adjacent ground level, and block F being 12.55 metres above adjacent ground level.
Can I just step in and ask a question of the head of planning? There's been much talk about the number of stories within this application. What does planning policy say about setting precedents on the height or number of stories? Which would carry most weight in planning terms for future applications? Would it be height or would it be stories?
So, members, as you are all very familiar as members of the Planning Committee, each application needs to be looked at on its own merits. You're looking at in the context of the environment it's being built on and the characteristics of the site. So, for example, if you allowed a 5-storey building on a site and then an application came in on the adjoining site, but the adjoining site ground level was another 4 stories higher, it doesn't mean that 5 stories would be acceptable on the adjoining site because it isn't the same site. So you need to look at it in context and in the context of the site, rather than thinking because you've allowed 5 stories in on one site, then it sets a precedent for 5 stories on a site within the surrounding area.
Thank you. Councillor Gale.
Thank you, Chair. It's a tricky one, and the site has upsides and downsides on it, really. Upside, the location is great for public transport. The site's in an obvious area due to the location and being a brownfield site, but there are too many downsides. It's doing absolutely nothing to enhance the walking and cycling outside of the site. East Street, as Councillor Powell had said, this is probably the last chance of doing anything there to make a footway or cycleway, which is something that we are supposed to look out for. We need housing, but not to the detriment of the existing residents, which we fear is the case here. Councillor Hess quoted 2 planning conditions, DM4, which is regarding height, DM5, the impact it has on existing occupants. As the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan clearly states 4-storey at this site, but we're looking at 6-storey. I understand what the head of planning has said because you're looking at ground levels and things like that, but they've said 4-storey. That we've got some 6 stories here, and we see absolutely nothing to relieve the lack of affordable or social housing, as Councillor Rabini said. I would like to see this actually deferred and go back to the developer and give them a chance to bring something forward which actually will use that site, which will help the people of Farnham, and it will ease the burden on the people already living there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gale. I think Councillor MacLeod and then Councillor Weldon.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask about 3 questions and then make some comments. The first question relates to the points that Mr. Saunders made about what he called the canyon effect, and also what Councillor Hess said about the distance between across the East Street. In the officer report, it refers to the distance being between 12 and 15 metres, and it then goes to refer to this as, in a positive way, as an enclosure effect, as if that's a good thing. And it refers to, if I can read what it says, this would reflect and help the development integrate with strong sensitive enclosure provided by historic development in central Farnham, i.e. the borough, whereas an approximate 9 metres between the 3-storey frontages on either side. Now, I think that's a terrible example to choose. The borough is one of the worst places in Farnham in terms of walking down that borough between Castle Street and the traffic lights. You've got very narrow pavements. You've actually got 2 very narrow roads. And the Farnham Infrastructure Project, one of the main objectives is to improve the borough by actually widening the pavements. And we can't knock down the buildings, but we can narrow the road to one lane. So this enclosure effect is not a positive thing in the borough. To choose that as an example is a pretty bad example, I have to say. So that's my first question, if you like. My second question relates to car parking, actually. Car parking has changed quite a lot in the time I've been a councillor. The Surrey guidance at one time was one parking space per flat or per dwelling. Then the Woolmead development actually brought that down to 1 between 2, when the Woolmead developers were allowed to reduce the size of the car park by 50%. This application provides 37 car parking spaces for 160, approximately 159, which is less than a quarter actually. So I just wonder, when there's comments about the effect of car parking within the site, it talks about it being detracting from the amenity of the site, the car parks and the actual roads within the site to provide car parking, whether it's sensible to have car parking at all. If you're actually, the solution to the car parking problem probably should be, as I think the town council suggested, that residents who buy flats in this development should be encouraged not to have car parking at all, and not be allowed to apply for car parking elsewhere on the within the car parking areas. So that's a comment on that. And a much better solution, it seems to me, would be to have something like a car club within this scheme, as I think they were going to have in the Woolmead, where you might have 10 cars or something that could be rented as necessary, and that could serve all the flats, the whole 150, not just 37 of them. And so I just think we're heading in the direction anyway of completely limiting car parking, and this development should really be sold to people who don't really want to have cars. So that's two questions. Third question actually is, I'm not sure we got a total answer to Councillor Hyman's comments actually. You partially answered them in response to what Councillor Beeman said, but he was actually alleging that there's a legal reason why we couldn't pass this application at all, and I'd like an answer to that, whether Councillor Hyman has a valid point. Once you've answered these questions, I have some comments I'd like to make. Thank you, Chairman.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Councillor MacLeod. The canyon effect that you referred to, the enclosure ratio of 1:1 is really the urban designer's own advice on this scheme. And he does draw distinct comparisons with the town centre as well, because that's part of the characterisation of the town centre. And his advice, as you will see from the quite detailed comments which are on the website, that it's not it's not unacceptable. It would be part of the historic fabric, or close to, of the town centre. So we have to rely on our own urban designer officer's expert opinion on characterisation, form, massing, height, and ratios. There isn't a standard anywhere that says that you must build to a certain distance across a public highway. And I welcome anybody who can find that for me, because there isn't one. We don't even have it in our SPD. No planning authority has it in the country. And I should know, I've worked for at least 10 of them now. The only distances we have for privacy are the back-to-back privacy issues. And this is clearly set out in our SPD, and this is why I've referred to those distances. And the minimum is 20. And there's a marginal shortfall with the cottages. So the answer to the first question is, yes, you can interpret that as a canyoning effect. I mean, there are buildings in every urban environment at given heights and given distances, dependent on the historic road network, if you like. And this happens to be one. And in our view, the proposal in terms of the alleged canyoning effect, it is not a matter that we can refuse it on. I hope that answers a question on the canyoning effect. But it is clearly set out in the report, because there's quite a bit of comment or advice which has been paraphrased in the report on these massing and design and scale issues. we've gone into quite a bit of depth into the detail of how we've assessed these. And as I said, there are additional comments made by the urban designer on that point, which is published on our website. Now, on the car parking.
So on the car parking, you're quite right. This could be a zero parking development because it's a town centre. It's a permeable site, so you've increased access through the site that doesn't exist at the moment. So in terms of promoting walking, it's a site that promotes walking. But, you know, I will try and speak louder then. In answer to your question, this is a site that could be granted planning permission with no parking because it's a highly sustainable town centre site, and doing that would be in line with national planning policy. It's also a permeable site, so at the moment you can't go through the site to get from one side to the other, but part of the proposal introduces walking opportunities so that people can come off that main road, which is quite tight and quite busy, and walk through the site. So it does improve walking and therefore, aligns with national policy in terms of encouraging walking, not only for the occupants, but for other users of that area. So that's the answer, members, you'll need to make a decision whether or not you want a car-free development on this site, which would obviously change all sorts of things. In terms of the full response, which apologies I thought I had given to Councillor Hyman, our view is that there is capacity in Farnham Park and the appropriate assessment has been completed on that basis. But the explanation I gave you around the numbers, with the appeal that's just been allowed, that takes it to 172, not 171. And for that reason, we think we are taking a precautionary approach by putting a Grampian style condition on. But members, again, it's for you to make a decision whether or not you want to add a condition where you're minded to approve the scheme. But legally, our view is you are able to determine this application this evening.
Thank you for that explanation, Claire. Councillor Weldon, I'll come back to you after.
Thank you. First, a general point and then a very specific question. The general point is that, as I've noted before, we have a fundamental problem in Waverley, that right across the borough, there is a strong desire to protect our green spaces, but we also have a critical desire, a critical need to provide a lot more housing. And it seems to me the only way we can achieve both of those is by increasing densities. It will not be enough to simply rely on infill. We effectively are going to have to build up. And for that reason, I think this development in principle does exactly that. And so in broad terms, I welcome the proposal. I think the main objection to that, and I've heard this from several speakers and from the residents, is that we're going beyond what the 4-storey limit proposed in the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan. The problem there, I think, is that the Farnham Plan was produced a number of years ago. And since then, the requirement imposed on us by the national level is effectively to double our housing allocation. On that basis, I think we are going to have to accept that in times we're going to need to go higher than we might have liked to do. And on that basis, I generally speak, in broad terms, welcome the proposal. There are some issues, some details, but I welcome the proposal. My question relates to a more fundamental objection, and that is, once again, comes back to this issue of affordable housing. My instinct, given the suggestion that it's not viable with affordable housing, is to the developer to go away and come back with a proposal that is viable. However, I know that that's not an acceptable response. I know that the regulations allow them to get away with that on the basis that there is an independent assessment done. My concern is that these assessments can be fudged. We recently had a situation in Hindhead where the development was allowed without affordable housing precisely because there wasn't, the assessment showed it was not viable. And yet, when the development came to market, the properties were on sale at an eye-watering price. So here's my question. Presumably these viability assessments are done on the basis of some kind of assessment of likely price of the dwellings. So the question is, if this assessment is based on this particular prices for the development, for the dwellings, and we later find that they are being sold at a much higher price, do we in fact have any recourse? Thank you.
So just in answer to the question, and you're quite right, you know, we are have to look at evidence, the viability assessment. We employ independent qualified experts on viability that advise us as officers, and the advice on this was that the scheme as submitted was not viable in terms of delivering affordable housing, and in part that is due to the fact that it's a brownfield site and it's already got existing buildings on that have values. So it's a different dynamic from dealing with the greenfield site. Though obviously brownfield first is the principle in the National Planning Policy guidance, and making most effective use of land is also a policy within the National Planning Policy framework. So in answer to your question, this is obviously a scheme that is a phased development and will be built out over a period of time. So it is possible in a different market and further into the development that the sales values will be higher than was in the viability assessment. And so members, were you minded to grant permission, it is open to you to look at a clause in the legal agreement to do a reassessment of viability at an appropriate phase within the development to enable to then see what the economy and the development economics of the scheme look like at a later stage.
Thank you, Claire. I'm aware of you, Councillor MacLeod, but I'm going to invite Councillor Rivers to have a shot first.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Well, I really can't support a deferral. It's obviously taken 5 years for this application to reach this point, and we have ample information for decision making. To my mind, this is clearly not overdevelopment. It's not out of keeping. It's a great improvement on what is existing, and it's very like the development outside of this very hall, which is now considered to have settled in and to be a very attractive town centre development, absolutely appropriate for its location. People can walk into town. And in addition, the sum that is delivered by SIL is a material consideration. So I am minded, like Councillor Weldon, not to object.
Thank you, Councillor Rivers. Councillor MacLeod.
Thank you, Chairman. Can I first of all thank the officers for their previous answers to my questions. I'll just comment briefly though, in terms of the first question about the canyon effect, the officer clearly has much more detailed technical knowledge than I have, and I wouldn't argue with his reply in that sense. But I will point out that using the borough as an example was not a good example. As I said before, it's highly unpopular in that part of Farnham. It's air polluted as well, and so on and so forth. So it wasn't a good answer to choose. But otherwise, you gave a good answer. In terms of the point about car parking, I would first prefer to see us have a no parking at all scheme here, and if we have the opportunity to defer it, that could be considered. And I was happy with the third answer. I'd like to make some general points about this development, though. If we were here considering an outline planning application, the principle of development and so on, and access, I think we would all agree it very, very quickly. There's no dispute about the suitability of this site for development. But overall, I'm afraid I do find this a disappointing development, actually. In terms of the town council's comments and things relating to the neighbourhood plan, the neighbourhood plan was for 150 dwellings with 215 dwellings per hectare on what was stated then to be a 0.7 of a hectare site. In fact, according to the actual more accurate information we have now, the site is 0.67 hectare, which actually means if you had the development density that the town council was looking for, you would have only been putting in 144 dwellings, in fact, because the density has gone up by 10%, sorry, and the number of housing appears only to have gone up by 6%. And the reason is because the two calculations use different site values in terms of the size of the site. But as I say, I do find it disappointing application. The town council is clearly disappointed in terms of it's not what they were looking for. It's not a 4-story high buildings, on the site, which is in keeping with the rest of Farnham, and it may be seen to be setting an unfortunate precedent in terms of having six-story buildings. The County Highway Authority is clearly disappointed in the sense that they do refer to it specifically as a missed opportunity to widen the pavements in East Street. There's a number, all of the objectors are clearly very disappointed, and it's not just the local residents, it's not just the people living nearby. The Farnham Society has put in a very well argued objection to it, as has Councillor Powell and other people who don't live near the site. And as others have said, it's disappointing that there's no affordable housing on this site. So I personally support the idea that had been suggested that we should defer this application to give the developer the chance to readdress these concerns. I want to say, on the other hand, actually, that I do not blame the officers, or I don't dispute the officers having recommended this application, in the sense that we're in a very difficult position in Waverley and in Farnham, that the government's standard method of calculation requires Waverley and therefore Farnham to produce a quite ridiculous number of houses. The number's gone up from when I was first involved with planning at Waverley. We were talking about 250 houses a year across the whole of Waverley. Then it became something like 500, then it went up to 800. Now we're talking about something like 1,400. And the reason to do all this is not actually to necessarily provide the required housing for the residents. It's part of the standard method actually attempts to drive down housing prices by encouraging developers to produce a lot more houses, which should bring down housing prices. But developers don't do that, and they've no intention of doing it. In fact, they will continue to produce a number of houses that they're businesses, and you can't criticise them for this. They will continue to produce a number of houses that maximises their profits. And that puts Waverley in a very difficult position, that we finish up with just over a 1-year, 5-year housing supply, whereas the government requires us to have 5. And therefore the officers are put in the position where they're almost obliged to actually approve these sort of applications, because they know there's a very, very good chance that the planning inspectorate will overrule the council if they don't. So I've got no real criticism of the officers for having recommended the application, that they're doing their job, what they feel is the right thing for the borough. But I do feel that what we should be doing is asking the developer to think again, and I would very much support the suggestion from 1 or 2 other councillors that we defer this application and give the developer the opportunity to reconsider the points made here and elsewhere. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor MacLeod. Councillor Spence.
Thank you, Chair. I find myself in very much agreement with what Councillor MacLeod and Councillor Weldon have said. There's a balance here that we all obviously have to weigh very carefully. And I think the report explains that. It also indicates where, as Councillor MacLeod has said, there are grave disappointments in what could have been achieved. I'm frankly troubled, though, by the affordable housing and the lack of. It's not that there is some affordable housing. They are proposing no affordable housing, whereas I think the standard rule would have been something like 48 affordable units. So to have none is really, to me, sticks in the gullet. I think I heard, and I would be grateful if the officer could confirm, said that there is a mechanism by which we could recoup, if I can say, any surplus profit if the housing prices exceed what has been put in the independent report. And I think I heard you say that that could be done but through a clause in the legal agreement. Could I have just confirmation of that?
Yes, I did confirm that it is open to the committee should they be minded to do that, because this is a phased development to actually where they're minded to grant planning permission to grant it on the basis that there's a clause in the legal agreement that allows a reassessment of the viability at an appropriate trigger, and that would be something that would need to be negotiated with the applicants through the Section 106 negotiation, so that it would allow that reassessment. It may come out still that there's no affordable housing, but it doesn't close the door completely on affordable housing on this site. The other option, obviously, to provide affordable housing would be to provide more units of accommodation on the site, because then that would change the viability.
Thank you.
Do we have any other speakers? Well, I think we've come to a crossroads. We have two options, I think. One is to defer, or the second option is to go straight to the vote. So as 2 or 3 members have suggested deferral, I think we have to be clear on what we're asking. If we go for deferral, what are we asking the developer to do? I can see you, Councillor Hess. Perhaps before we make that decision, we could hear some summing up remarks from Councillor Hess.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. I'd also like to thank colleagues for their thoughtful and considered comments tonight. It is a difficult one, I grant you, but I'd just like to take you back to the fundamental point I made earlier, which was, at the all-member briefing, we were told you need policies if you wish to recommend for refusal. Now, we may not be able to refuse on the canyoning effect, but we can refuse on not complying with policies. And I referred earlier, and I would just point out to Councillor Weldon that the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan is actually still extant, which means it's still in force for quite a long time, actually. So it's still a relevant supplementary planning document for this planning authority. And what I said earlier was, if you take FNP 14J, which is a policy, it's a Waverley policy, and it's still in force. Advantage should be taken of the sloping site with 4-storey development stepping down the natural slope. That's in the policy. You can look at it in the neighbourhood plan. It's there in black and white. That's policy. But instead, what we're getting is 6 stories, which is not a minor adjustment upwards. It's a major adjustment upwards. It's actually trampling on the spirit of the neighbourhood plan. That's not right. So also going on to further policies, if you take FNP1, new development in accordance with the neighbourhood plan will be permitted where it's designed to high quality. Well, I'm not pushing back on that. Responds to the heritage and distinctive character of the individual area of Farnham, etc. But then it should be relevant in terms of height, scale, density, layout, orientation. No. The scale, design and materials of the public realm, highways, footways. No. Respects the natural contours of the site. Well, it's clearly not, because FNP 14J says something different, as I just read out. And finally, will not be at an unacceptable risk of flooding itself and will not result in any increased risk of flooding elsewhere. Well, we know what the local lead flooding authority have to say. They're objecting. So it's not looking very good on policy grounds. And I would like to just come back to something that Barry Saunders wrote. In brief, we believe that Block E will effectively do harm to us in terms of health, well-being, and loss of amenity. Various appeals and judgments have shown that amenity must be evaluated holistically and in the round, and not just on individual considerations. And I think generally, with these various policies and the local Farnham Local Plan 2 policies, there are plenty of elements in there, policy-wise, to not just defer this, but refuse it properly, to really give the architects time to go back to the drawing board and come back with something really appropriate for our town. If we get this wrong, it's going to wreck that end of eastern end of Farnham, and we cannot have that. So please consider carefully, perhaps refusing rather than just deferring. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hess. Now, as I said, we have a choice here. I think it'd be appropriate to ask the committee whether they would want to defer or whether they want to decide this evening. So I think let's have a show of hands for those members in favour of deferral.
So you've got a recommendation to approve. If you could just put your hands down a minute, sorry.
Right, I stand corrected. There is an official way of doing this, which is one of the members has to come forward with a motion for deferral, and that member has to have a seconder. So do we have someone who wishes to put forward a motion for deferral? Councillor Gale, you have a seconder, I believe, in Councillor MacLeod. Before we go into detail, do you have an outline of why?
Well, I would like to defer to give the developer the chance to come back and answer some of the queries that have been put forward tonight, specifically some of the points that have been put forward, as in the DM4, DM5, the FNP 14J and the FNP1, because I think they are all relevant, and I would like to give them the opportunity to come back. And I would also like to have seen some affordable and social housing on there, but I don't think that's a possibility from what our Assistant Director of Housing has said.
So members, if you're going to defer, then you have to defer to get the developer to do something. You can't ask them to come back and answer questions on the planning policy. So if you think there's harm caused by this scheme, i.e. the policy says this and you're demonstrating harm, you therefore would be looking to defer to ask the developer to consider amending the scheme in a way, and you don't have to say because you want the windows changed, or what is it that you want the developer to look at? So are you asking them to amend the scheme to take parking up, for example, or are you asking them to amend the scheme to increase the number of dwellings or decrease the height of the building? So specifics, so the applicant, the developer will be very clear what the committee are asking them to do to make this development acceptable.
Okay, so we had a DM4, which is relevant to the height of the properties. Is that something we can ask them to look at? And we had a DM5, which is the impact it has on existing occupants around and about the site. Is that something we can ask them to come back for?
So you're deferring because you are, as a committee, not satisfied with the height of the buildings that have been put before you, and you believe that the impact that's been assessed, as there is some impact, but on balance will accept that against the benefits, that you want them to look at the impact on daylight and sunlight that's been referenced in Simon's report. Is that what you're thinking?
If you don't mind if I ask my seconder if there's anything else.
I'm very happy to second. Yeah, I think the main point is about the height of the buildings. Also, actually, I would question a little bit the density. The density in this site is very, very high for Farnham. We've got very, very bulky buildings here. There's nothing else like this in Farnham, in fact. If you look at the neighbourhood plan, I think the next highest density of anything that's been proposed is 75 dwellings per hectare. This one, the town council wanted it to be 215, and it's actually turned out to be 237. And the number therefore has gone up from 144, which it should have been in the neighbourhood plan, rather than 150. So they've got their calculation right, to 159. So I think we should be asking them to relook at the density, because this is exceptional density in Farnham. It's the sort of density you get in central London, actually, not in market towns like Farnham. So I think the two main things we'd be asking to look at is the height of the buildings and the density issue.
Thank you, Councillor MacLeod. So, as it stands, the guidance that Claire gave us, and with what Councillor Gale has been saying, is if we agree to defer, the reasons would be a decrease in density and height to reduce the impact on local residents. Am I correct?
I think you've nailed it.
Thank you. In that case, we will go to. Do you want to speak, Councillor Spence?
I just wish to. It's a observation that we talked about the affordable housing. I would certainly would like to see at least a review of the affordable housing provisions by the developer in any deferment. Thank you.
So members, just to give you advice, if you're asking the developer to go away and reduce the number of dwellings on this site and the height, so you're going to take the number down. If you've got a scheme that's only just viable at the current number, what are you trying to achieve then in terms of reducing the number? So reduce the overall profit, etc., etc. Members, I think you do need to be mindful of the cost and the rationale behind asking developers to go away and do pieces of work that take time and considerable cost. And if you're asking to have a smaller development, then your viability is going to go further to the non-viable, non-deliverable. I would suggest or advise you.
Actually, before you, councillor Weldon, I have councillor Lawton, then I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually agree with the planning director. My worry is, and I've just shifted my position a little bit, if we ask for deferral, there's a limited incentive for the developer to make any change. If we ask for a refusal, then the developer has to work harder to justify his position or not proceed.
Of course, the developer could go straight to appeal. Yeah. Councillor Weldon.
Thank you. I'm against the idea of a deferral for a simple reason, as Councillor Rivers has already pointed out. This has been a long time in the development. What is being asked for now is not simple minor changes. They're pretty fundamental to the scheme as a whole. You're effectively asking the developer to go away and start again. And that's just going to add to the cost and the timing of getting anything done. So I'm strongly against deferral.
Yeah, we're now voting as a committee on whether to defer or not to defer. And of course, if we vote not to defer, then we go to decision.
Sorry, Chair, is green not to defer and red's to defer?
Chair, we have 5 in favour, 5 against and 2 abstentions. Yes, so it's your casting. Oh, actually, excuse me, Chair, I need to count that again. No, you don't. It's 5-4-2. So it's 5 in favour, 4 against and 2 abstentions. So 5 in favour to defer, 4 against deferral and 2 abstentions. It's carried.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. The deferral is the deferral motion is therefore carried at a recount. So do we need to go back to the original recommendation and refuse that? We don't. Right. Okay. And have we got enough reasoning? Yeah. Okay. Members and members of the public, this meeting at 9:06 is closed.